our land, the people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging, and really to extend that acknowledgement to all different parts of the world and traditional custodians of all the lands that you all are part of, and really extending that acknowledgement to know that our roots are strong and our cultures are diverse, and we should really appreciate it moving forward. And that forms the fabric of our society. So before we begin, I'm just going to go over a couple of things regarding Zoom etiquette, some of the housekeeping things. So we urge that everybody keeps their microphones muted while the conversation and the discussion is going on. So we're able to hear the speakers out clearly without any interruption. And also, we will be taking audience questions over the Zoom chat function. So please feel free to send out all your questions over the course of the discourse, and we will ensure that we will answer them in our best capacity. And apart from that, the other thing that I normally recommend is using speaker view instead of gallery view. And speaker view is available on the top right-hand corner of your screen. And that ensures that the speakers or whoever is communicating at that time has the most screen real estate, so you get to see them in their full glamour. So with that, let me begin our conversation. So 2015 was a landmark year for the world, and one that had a lot of very pivotal agreements that were agreed upon. And one of the main ones that really defines our generation is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So 17 goals and 159 targets were agreed upon by 193 member nations of the United Nations, and really solidified the need and the vision for our future, so that we as a world, as a globe, as a single unit, work towards fixing a lot of the global challenges that are currently prevalent in our societies and communities, and really addressing key challenges to allow everybody to co-develop, grow together, and ensure that our future generations have a strong earth to breathe on. But that said, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals was not the first time that sustainable development was actually addressed. So in 1987, the Brundtland Commission published arguably one of the most popular definitions of sustainable development. And sustainable development, as defined by them, is sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability for future generations to meet their own needs. And really contain two key concepts, which needs is essential needs of the world's poor, and the overriding priority should be given to them. And furthermore, it also idealized certain limitations of the state of technology at the time and the social organization of the environment's ability to meet present and future needs. But that has changed significantly comparing it to present day. So on the other hand, I hope all of you actually have been able to have a view of the film that we shared when you signed up. A really beautiful documentary by Fairtrade. And Fairtrade is in fact a global movement, and their certification provides and ensures that products are produced according to rigorous economic, social, and environmental standards, and they seek to enable economic development through equitable trading partnerships, ensuring consumers that the products that they purchase were grown, harvested, and traded in ways that improve lives, benefit communities, and protect the environment. So it's actually extremely important that we look at the world in a certain lens where we are rewarding the producers of our products in no matter where we live in the world and no matter where that product was produced. And Fairtrade works extensively across the globe to ensure that it's elevating lives and constantly making for a better planet. And the three pillars of fair trade standards are the principles of economic, social, and environmental principles. And Fairtrade is in a unique position to be able to contribute to many different issues at once. Therefore, it very well aligns with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and all the work that they do extensively contributes towards achieving these goals by 2030. And that's what sets us into this particular discussion, making a world a better place. In this panel, we hope to touch on key issues that we might have understanding of and really extend that conversation to the present times that we live in, address, what are the key challenges during the pandemic and how we can go forward developing into the future to contribute towards those goals that we set in 2015 and really extensively look at it from a macro lens as well as a micro lens to understand how each of us has an equally important role in addressing key challenges of the world and achieving big and pivotal goals such as zero hunger, education for all, gender equity, addressing climate change, and all of it rounds up to goal 17, which is maintaining partnerships and collaboration, because that forms the basis of any successful initiative. So with that, I would love, and it's with my pleasure to introduce our speakers. This is Dr. Zeny Edwards, Sarah Morse, Nicole Lamond, and Molly Harris Olson. Before we start the conversation, let me just quickly also introduce our speakers. So let me start with Molly. Molly is currently the CEO of Fairtrade Australia and New Zealand and has served on the board of Fairtrade International for 6 years and even chaired the board for the final 2 of her term. She's been at the forefront of leadership for sustainable business and development for 3 decades, including roles as the director and co-founder of EcoFutures, an Australian-based international policy firm working on building sustainable strategies with business, government, and civic leaders, bringing them all under one roof. She was founder and convener of the National Business Leaders Forum on Sustainable Development, the president and CEO of the Natural Step USA, a not-for-profit environmental education organization working with business leaders, and the co-founder of Earthmark. Molly has been a member of numerous other boards, business leadership, sustainability initiatives, including, and something that I really enjoyed reading about, was she was also a part of the World Economic Forum's Global Leaders for Tomorrow. And in 2014, Molly received the Australian Financial Review and Westpac's 100 Women of Influence Award. She even worked with the White House under the Clinton government. So welcome. Next speaker is Nicole Lamond. Calls over 3,000 retailers worldwide, and she's really extending that reach of fair trade products around the world. She's been an active champion of fair trade too, since the starting of Universal Village in 1999, selling fair trade tea and coffee to the Body Shop, and later importing the first teas from fair trade certified farms into Australia. In 2003, she was the founding board member of the Fairtrade Association of Australia and New Zealand, and is currently the secretary. She holds a master in entrepreneurship and innovation and has a passion for doing business with purpose. So welcome, Nicole. Thanks for joining us today. That brings us to Dr. Zeny Edwards. Now, Dr. Zeny Edwards is an architectural historian, an award-winning biographer, and a cultural heritage advocate. Zeny has served on various lead roles, including the president of the National Trust of Australia in New South Wales. She is the chair of UN Women in Australia, the United Nations Entity for Gender Equality and the Empowerment of Women, a trustee for Women's Plans Foundation, and also worked as the vice president for the Institute of Global Peace and Sustainable Governance. She was a committee member for the Australian Peacekeeping Memorial Project in ACT, and joined the United Nations Association in Australia in 2013, and retired in 2018 as the director for the UNAA's Peace Program. She's currently a Goodwill Ambassador for the Institute of Economics and Peace, on the management team of the Australian Council for Human Rights Education, and continues to actively practice and be a great advocate for architectural history. So thank you, Zeny, for joining us today, and welcome.
Thank you.
That brings us to our final speaker, last but not least, Sarah Morse. Sarah is the former Young Australian of the Year in New South Wales and the Director of Unchained Business Services. Unchained is a for-purpose business that inspires Australian communities to be leaders of addressing modern slavery. 100% of Unchained's profits are reinvested back in social enterprises, providing meaningful employment for survivors of modern slavery and actively taking part and taking action on one of the world's most pressing challenges in supply chains of today. With over 25 years of humanitarian work experience, leadership, and cancer nursing, Sarah uses the lessons she's learned in all of these different realms to continue to inspire people with empathy, positivity, and purpose. She's extremely passionate about seeing Australian businesses increase trust in demonstrating authentic values and making ethical choices, and continues to advocate for cleaner, more ethical supply chains that really ensure that everybody is equal and equally remunerated for their hard work. So with that, welcome, Sarah.
Thank you. Hi.
So that brings us to all our speakers. We have an absolutely power-packed panel for all of you, and I'll do my level best in moderating it to my best capacity. With that, I'm going to jump on to the first question, and the first question is right to you, Molly. And what I'd like to ask about is, in terms of a supply chain of today, what does an ideal supply chain in the Fairtrade certification look like? And how does that actively contribute to sustainability in some ways? I think your microphone is muted, sorry.
I do have to unmute my audio. I think you're allowed to do that too. I think you can do that from the chair. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much. It's lovely to hear you introduce all of your wonderful panel, and it's a real privilege to be here. Look, what does the perfect supply chain look like? A perfect supply chain is pretty straightforward, because really all we're hoping for is that the value along that supply chain is actually shared reasonably with all the different players. And the most vulnerable, of course, are the ones on the farms that are actually growing the products, especially obviously in these agricultural commodities that we're talking about. And they're also the ones where the risks are the highest. So Fairtrade has structures that underpin trade in a way that enables producers to have a voice. So they're 50% owners of the Fairtrade system. To have a stable price. So the price of coffee and also cocoa they just move, most commodity prices do, but they move all over the place. And even as recently as last year, we had the whole country of Colombia pulling their coffee off the New York Stock Exchange, saying we refuse to allow anyone to buy our coffee at less than minimum price and premium of Fairtrade, because it's not worth it for our farmers to be growing coffee and subsidizing the market globally of coffee. And so it provides the only alternative trading system really in the world that enables the supply chain to be robustly and transparently audited to make sure that everybody's playing fair. And the minimum price and the premium is what protects the farmer, to ensure that they're not subsidizing, you know, our cup of coffee every day. They're not subsidizing our chocolate bar. And and that they're getting some reasonable value out of it. Now, we haven't achieved yet in the world today anything like sustainable livelihoods for farmers. But we are the only thing that's even close to a structural, globally scalable change to help them have a voice and have access. So I guess if you look at supply chains today, and it's great to have colleagues here that are working in modern slavery, because of course this is an issue that is really traumatic evidence of the fact that normal is not good enough. Normal is $150 billion every year in profits from modern slavery, 68% of which are in this part of the world. That's not a good normal. So in Fairtrade, we like to think that the solutions that we provide could be adopted by the whole world, and that if trade existed in that manner for everything we do in the world today, it would be an infinitely more sustainable planet for all of us living here today. I guess I'd also point out that even of the Fairtrade certified products that are out there in the world today, if everyone was receiving the minimum price and the premium and they were selling their commodities on Fairtrade terms, there'd be an extra $270 million every year going into the hands of just coffee farmers. Just coffee farmers would be earning so much more. So we have structures that are flawed, and Fairtrade's attempt is to create an alternative structure that improves on the fairness of it, the transparency of it, so that farmers can get a fair go. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely.
So the perfect supply chain, in other words, is farmers are getting paid a decent price, and all of the rest of the pieces of the supply chain are having a fair, reasonable return for their effort, but that we're not spending $4 on a cup of coffee when a farmer is getting, you know, pennies for pounds of beans. 66 cents for a pound of coffee is what the market price was last June.
Absolutely. That is such an important part of the equation. And that actually brings me to an interesting perspective on modern slavery. And this question is for you, Sarah. So while studying sustainability, I came across the Rana Plaza disaster that occurred in Bangladesh. And while we were doing a case study on it, I read a little bit about it to understand that the minimum wage was around 1,500 taka for a family in Bangladesh per month. And I equated that to the Australian dollar, and at the time it was around $17.50 approximately, which blew my mind in terms of what the disparity is between different communities around different places in the world. Whereas you have organizations that are significantly larger that are using them in their supply chain or procuring material from them. So in terms of sustainability and fair trade, and just in terms of how a supply chain of today impacts the world differently, what is the current view on modern slavery here in Australia? And how do consumers affect that part of the equation?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. Thank you. As we know, before COVID, there were around 46 million people currently living in slavery in the world today. And by slavery, we're talking about the commodification of people for the purposes of exploitation and financial gain. So the Rana Plaza is a brilliant example of that, where around 1,100 people were killed and 2,500 people were injured, working in very, very cramped conditions. And actually the stories coming out of Rana Plaza were saying that the people actually left the building. They saw cracks appearing in the building and were scared, and so they left out of the building, and then the bosses were actually pushing them back in. And so people who had tried to escape were forced back into those buildings, and then they collapsed. And that's just one example of modern slavery in the world today. So we know that of that 46 million, 2/3 of those are in the Asia Pacific region, and 60% are in forced labour. And so when we're looking at supply chains, we're really looking at both the consumer responsibility, but also the corporate responsibility. Because I think, you know, both of them work together, with the consumers putting pressures on the corporates. But I think the ultimate responsibility can't be on individual consumers to actually make those choices. While we want to promote fair trade products, definitely, And, you know, as we just heard from Molly, the impact of consumers buying fair trade products is extremely significant. But what we're looking at Unchained is really from the other end, looking at the end of the corporate responsibility on supply chains. So if a company here in Australia is more transparent and more responsible for the slaves in their supply chain, they'll actually be able to impact a far greater number of people than individual consumers. And so that's really what we're looking at, is to help Australian businesses comply, first of all, with the Modern Slavery Act. But we don't want people just to tick a box and say that they've complied. We actually want people to be leaders in making an impact on modern slavery. And so part of what we do is actually helping companies to understand that by changing their policies and procedures and actually looking at their supply chain as a whole, they can create a far greater impact. And then moving on from that, in terms of, you know, as we give our profits into the Freedom Business Alliance and actually helping people get jobs and recover from slavery and create meaningful partnerships with Australian corporates as well. So I think your question around consumers is important, and we all as consumers have to make choices every day, but also contacting the companies that we buy from and putting pressure on those companies to ask them what are they doing about the Modern Slavery Act and what are their policies around supply chains. So I think it goes both ways, both the consumers making active choices, but also consumers putting pressure up on corporates, and then corporates making those decisions which are ultimately going to impact on those supply chains and, you know, and hopefully have a far greater reaching impact for the people at the grassroots level in those supply chains.
Yeah, that absolutely answers the question, and it is extremely important. Like I kind of mentioned earlier, where everyone plays a pivotal role in this equation, and all of us have a voice that we can assert to impact communities around the world that are going through tough times. And that actually, I wanted to tease out your perspective on this, Nicole, as well, because you're a Fairtrade brand. You run a very nice and successful Fairtrade brand and are an active advocate for Fairtrade here in Australia. So how does, in your experience, how does the Fairtrade certification help your supply chain, and how does that lead into a positive impact in a consumer society?
Okay, so for Element's organic vitamin tea, so as you said, we're a mission-led business, and our mission is to help accelerate the world's transition to a living wage for all people. And we decided that fair trade system is the best way to do that, to be involved with that, because as Molly pointed out and you pointed out, it really is the world's most sort of comprehensive ethical trading system. So we're really happy to be a part of that. And it means that we can really stand behind the claims that we're making to consumers, and that we can give consumers a really singular, unified message. So that's really important that we've got that, and also that third-party endorsement, having that label on the product is really, really important for that, for the consumer messaging. Absolutely.
Absolutely. That sums up why one should look for a fair trade product or as a consumer, and why companies should be adopting the process a lot more to ensure people are looking at equitable partnerships, as opposed to one where, you know, you have absolute disparity between communities, even though they belong to different contexts.
Yeah. There are other benefits as well to being part of that system, and a lot of them are more sort of nebulous, as far as having good relationships with not only our fair trade suppliers, but also with other suppliers and vendors that we deal with. It's sort of a halo effect for the company, if you like. So we tend to have very high levels of trust with all our suppliers across the board, and everything from packaging suppliers to shipping agents, customs clearance agents, So that really helps us in quite a few ways. And it means we put a lot of emphasis on having good relationships with all our trading partners, even if they're outside of the sort of dedicated fair trade system as such. So that really helps a lot, and we spend a lot less on lawyers' fees.
Yeah, that's good. I guess if we all contribute in our ways at different levels, it does end up in having a much happier society as well, where we're all equal, we're all happy, we're all working towards a common vision. And that brings me to you, Dr. Zeny. So, given your experience with the UN and extensive experience in gender equity in different parts of the world, how does that affect the supply chains of today in different contexts? And how does that also impact, say, the Sustainable Development Goals?
Thank you, Pavit. The Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, are interconnected. So, you know, they all feed on each other. So if one fails, then it sort of starts. Others need to take action to solve that problem. Now, someone talked about modern slavery. We are interested not just in women equality, in gender equality, but in child labor. That is a big problem in vulnerable countries, and that is a big part of modern slavery. I just had a dialogue, the Australia-Vietnamese human rights dialogue this morning with the ambassador and the DFAT, and that came out as quite a big problem that people in those countries, in vulnerable countries, are using child labor, and that is a form of modern slavery. We are also interested in finding out the problems that affect fair trade and equity and gender parity and all of that in vulnerable countries, especially in helping farmers, for example, get a greater market access to their goods without the interference of middlemen who profiteer from their products. And we are also interested in sort of researching the fair treatment of the farmers and the laborers, that they get the fair wages and the income that they get from their produce. There is the low pay problem, the abuse, unsafe working environments, and gender parity and exploitation. That comes out, everything starts out quite well and good and honest, and then when one becomes productive and the produce gets more successful and the work becomes more successful, then the profiteers come in, and that is a problem, that the farmers and the producers get a fair treatment and get transparent, and that is what the UN is inspecting and making sure that everything is above board and nobody is treated unfairly. It is a very difficult problem because, you know, it is a very big problem and quite a few of the countries are involved in that. What else are we? We are, the United Nations is, SDGs are also encouraging more micro businesses and encouraging other organizations to support micro businesses. There's Opportunity International, and I visited the Philippines with that. It's a self-help program, and the farmers are allowed to borrow money and then they have to pay it back. It's not a charity thing. So that's what all SDGs are interconnected, but there are quite a few UN organizations, agencies that are helping out, like the International Labour Organization, the UNDP, and the UN SDG Fund, which has been established because of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yes, absolutely. We will definitely touch on how the pandemic has impacted it, but thank you for that answer. That was a very well put together understanding of the SDGs, and that actually does set the tone for another part of the discussion where we do look at SDGs in certain lenses. Sometimes we pick and choose which ones we look at, but we do acknowledge that all of them are interconnected at the same time. And I'd like to touch on one particular, or two SDGs actually, which seem to form the basis of all other SDGs. And one is goal number 1, which is ending poverty, and goal number 2, which is no hunger on the planet. And also remotely into goal number 4, which is education for all. And I particularly think that all these are interconnected because it really affects the remotest of communities that do not have as much access as us sitting in the comfort of our homes, for example. So, in fact, I'll ask you, Sarah, in terms of looking at specific SDGs, so goal number 1, which is no poverty and no hunger, along with education, how does that tend to impact or how does that manifest into positive change going into the future? And how do you think that will help us contribute towards achieving the other goals?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think you're right that that they are sort of 3 of the main crux points, I suppose, of the SDGs. We know that that poverty and lack of education are 2 of the leading causes of people ending up in situations of modern slavery and human trafficking. So, for example, I worked in a safe house for survivors of trafficking into the sex industry in Spain, and most of the women that we were working with came from Nigeria and Romania, both very, very poor countries. Most of the women had also a lack of education. And so, for example, one girl, a 19-year-old Nigerian girl that had no education, she was illiterate, but it was her responsibility to provide for her family in her parents' old age. And so when someone offered her a job in Europe, she thought, well, you know, I'll probably be cleaning hotels or looking after children. And so she took that job without understanding the risks involved, ended up getting trafficked into the sex industry in Spain, and obviously suffering great trauma from that. So, you know, I've seen firsthand the impact that poverty and lack of education have on modern slavery and human trafficking. And so I think that definitely as we address those things, as we seek to provide living wages for farmers, as we seek to end poverty and hunger so that people are more able to do fair work and then actually, you know, learn and go to school as well. I think that that definitely will impact on all of the other SDGs. And yeah, we know that the statistics around those, particularly around girls getting educated in those areas, have lower incidences of modern slavery. So, you know, and we have a close relationship with Outland Denim in Cambodia, working, running a sustainable workforce there. And for many of the women there, you know, when they're asked, what is your greatest goal? What, you know, they don't want to be lawyers or doctors or things. What they want to do is send their children to school. That's their greatest goal. So to earn enough to be able to feed their family and to send their children to school. And so that their children might receive an education and take a step out of that poverty that they were born into. So I think definitely by ending poverty and hunger and allowing people an education definitely impacts globally on modern slavery.
Well, that's a very well put answer. Thank you. I'll actually extend that same question to Nicole. In your experience interacting with producers in different parts of the world, how does this sort of notion impact your supply chain? as a business, and what does it impact in terms of materiality to achieve your business goals and act as a business that is practicing with purpose?
Okay, so as far as how it impacts producers, so we pretty much leave that to Fairtrade, and we trust that Fairtrade is doing its job, and it has its auditors out on the ground inspecting, keeping up standards, and we hopefully hold them accountable to that. As far as supply chain, I was thinking while Molly was talking earlier, from a business perspective, we also want supply chains to be efficient and hopefully as short as possible, which can be good if it cuts out people who aren't actually adding any value to the product. So, I mean, that's one of the great things about Fairtrade, is that it does tend to shorten supply chains. So it does mean that more value can go to the farmers who do that absolutely incredible and important job of actually growing the food that we love to eat. So that's a big positive. Yeah, one of my most fondest memories actually of visiting Fairtrade cooperatives in China and Sri Lanka, visiting the schools and visiting kindergartens and seeing how much the kids are flourishing there. And you can see that they're, they have materials, they have books, they have qualified teachers. So seeing that is really so rewarding from a business owner's perspective, to see that you're part of that. And that's one of the really wonderful things about being involved in Fairtrade, which conventional business owners miss out on. And I mean, they love speaking to me and my business partner, Julie Hirsch, about, how we're making a difference, and people are curious. And that's really fantastic, because the press are also curious. So it means we get a few advantages on the side from being Fairtrade. I hope that answers your question somewhat.
Yeah, absolutely does. And so that brings me to another perspective, and I'm trying to understand the impact of, or the voice that Fairtrade as an organization and UN as an organization. So this will go from Molly to Zeny. So in terms of advocacy and influence on businesses, as well as liaising with the government or governments, so to speak, in different countries, how does Fairtrade play a strong role in pursuing businesses and governments alike to adapt a more sustainable and more ethical model, and following the Fairtrade process or bringing its values to the table? So Molly first. I think I'm unable to unmute you, Molly. Sorry.
Unmute my audio, sorry. It is, thank you. It is a good question. And I guess Fairtrade, it's interesting. Just to kind of step back for a moment and say, the Sustainable Development Goals are a phenomenal framework for the world for two reasons. One is it creates a roadmap that's consistent, so all of us can kind of try to hold each other to account, and they're measurable. But if we think of the Millennium Development Goals, which were similarly, clear, and there were much fewer of them, we had some great successes. So we doubled the number of children in schools. We have the number of extreme hunger, cases. We doubled the number of women in parliament, for instance. Those were all fantastic goals. But again, I just want to remind us that, but as soon as something happens, like COVID or some other crisis, we immediately lose that ground. So it's like taking, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. we actually now are in a situation where we have an even better set of goals, and they're better for a million reasons, mainly because it enables all of us to take responsibility. And instead of rich countries saying, oh, let us help you, little poor countries, let us show you the way, you know, we're actually dealing with overconsumption and obesity and, you know, a bunch of other questions that are also part of the global problem that we have. I mean, if we took the extreme hunger and the obesity and just sort of, you know, shared out the resources, it's amazing how much we could achieve. So there's a structural problem here. And I guess what I would say is that until we solve that structural problem of a failure of vulnerable farmers to have power in their supply chains, and a failure of the pricing system to fairly represent this, and transparency so we can see it and measure it, what happens today, which is what worries Fairtrade, we have developed a robust, trusted, deeply impactful system. But as you can imagine, it costs more than modern slavery. So, you know, and that's where all of the drivers are. So if we think about what is it to run a company, companies like Nicole's are leaders because they're actually investing in these supply chains. We've created a system of trust and transparency that enables them to make the tough decisions, which is, yep, I'm going to do the right thing, not just make a lot of noise and say, yay, aren't we good? We're basking in the glow of being sustainable, but actually doing the right things. The Sustainable Development Goals are important because they have that measurable component, but they could be pushed back as soon as we hit the next pandemic. They can be pushed back as soon as, you know, it's very difficult for, unless we can address these structural problems, then the new normal is going to be just as bad as the old normal. So I guess I would say these goals are vital. And they're helping all of us to have the same conversation and to try to hold each other to account. But actually, Fairtrade is almost unique. I don't know of any other system that is globally scaled that has the kinds of structures like minimum prices, premiums. I mean, Fairtrade was able to, the International Board immediately changed the standards of Fairtrade for COVID to enable farmers to access their premium for COVID-related protection, for COVID-related awareness, for anything they needed to keep their community healthy. There were no other producers in the world who had a safety net of any kind except Fairtrade producers. And that's kind of scary because we're only dealing with 2 million farmers and their communities. So we are a large globally scaled system, but I just want to emphasize that because I think we need to think of these Sustainable Development Goals as a way of helping everybody understand the problem so that we can actually change the structures, so that the transparency for modern slavery isn't something that just good companies do because they feel like it. It's actually part of what becomes the new normal. So I want to emphasize that because I do think that it's really difficult. These are really difficult issues, and the Sustainable Development Goals are going to take us, they're going to help us a lot. But wow, you know, we've got a big challenge in front of us. And at the moment, you know, I think about 10% of the world's coffee is actually purchased on Fairtrade terms. And that's just not nearly enough. And there's no other system that's providing those structural changes.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that answers your question.
I've been drinking a lot of Fairtrade coffee, so every time I go, one of my favorite coffee stores, in fact, is Fairtrade certified. They're also a B Corporation, which is great.
Which one is that?
So it's Jasper Coffee Roasters.
Yeah, they're fantastic.
In Chatston, although I haven't been able to go there with the radius and everything.
No.
Yeah, absolutely, very critical that it is a systemic issue. It's a structural issue as well, and that actually brings me to you, Zeny, which just to understand better from your perspective about how the UN, say, liaises with these producers or the governments in order to keep them accountable. Because while so many member countries of the United Nations have agreed upon these goals and these targets and are working in some form or the other to achieve them, on the ground, in the coalface, we aren't seeing as many changes as we would have hoped for. And of course, there is the pandemic that just struck us out of nowhere. But what is that role in advocacy that UN plays and in liaising with other organizations, such as Fairtrade, in getting, to mobilize communities and governments alike.
Yeah, I think that my Zoom is a bit unstable at the moment, Pavit, but I'll try my best. The UN does things from the bottom up. Am I being, is it okay? Can I be heard?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, from the bottom up to empower the farmers. First of all, we need to look after their health. So to make sure that they are well and contented, and their children are fed, and they have disability insurance, and they're taken care of, and they're not marginalized and abused. So first of all, if you have a happy and healthy farmer, then that follows from there. And also the value of education. I think farmers need to learn more about bit in a way to find out how their business works, if they're going to have a business, and how they should be treated, and what process will get them a fair go from the producers and from the market. It's all very difficult. It is a big problem, mainly because there's so many agencies and so many farmers, and there's not enough workers and experts to help. So what we are trying to do, train people in those areas, those people that are living in those areas, to train other farmers to sort of go and do it. It's a self-help program that sort of just goes around in a cycle. It's like a cooperative. So you teach people to do things, and then they help each other to do that. So education is the most important. And I think we went to Siem Reap in Cambodia, where there is an outfit, and the children there are fed breakfast before they learn, because malnutrition is a big problem. So we are more concerned with health and the well-being of the farmers before they can become productive and financially literate. So does that make sense to you? Sort of, we do that because that's the basis of success in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the pandemic hit us out of nowhere, took us by surprise. And all these things that we thought of and envisioned, and we said, hey, it's 2020, we can pull up our socks and start working on these goals, go in full swing. And just as soon as the new decade hit, the pandemic came with a surprise. So that has evidently impacted everyone's lives in one way or another. For some of us, it's working from home. For some of us, it's no work at all. And for producers around the world, for people in vulnerable communities in countries such as Brazil and India that are seeing skyrocketing number of cases, with a lack of government-aided health care. That's one of the biggest issues that I've been reading about recently. So, Sarah, what impact has the pandemic had on these goals, on sustainability, on modern slavery, and what is your take on it at the moment, and how can we move past?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, as Molly said, a lot of the good work that has been done over the last decade, unfortunately now is being undone by COVID. So in terms of supply chain, I mean, early on we saw disruption of supply chains, and probably here in Australia, it was the first time a lot of people had really thought about supply chains when they couldn't get toilet paper, when they went to Kmart and the shelves were empty in the kitchen section. They're like, what do you mean I can't buy what I need when I need it? And so I think that was a really clear example of how we are all interconnected, and we're all being impacted, by COVID. But obviously the people at the other end of the supply chains are the ones that suffer the most. And so, you know, early on we saw in Bangladesh, you know, overnight, around 1,100 factories in Bangladesh were closed. And, you know, thousands and thousands of workers were just laid off. You know, there's a story of that I read of one lady that was literally just at her sewing machine, you know, working away, and she was just tapped on the shoulder and told, don't come back tomorrow, you don't have a job anymore. And she's like, well, I've got 2 kids at home, I'm the only income earner for our family, what do I do now? And so those kind of stories, unfortunately, being repeated over and over again around the world. We're seeing the lowering of standards as well, and sort of the supply chain transparency suddenly becoming a lot more murky as, you know, many checks and balances, which are usually there, have been waived because of the global disruption. People are working from home, so they don't necessarily have that visibility. You know, we're seeing those who are vulnerable becoming more so. You know, obviously increased threat of disease in densely populated areas. You know, I know it's a hassle for us here in Australia to wear masks and to isolate and to wash our hands. But those are all actually privileges, that we have masks, that we have enough housing, that we are able to isolate, that we have running water, that we are able to wash our hands. And in those countries that where poverty, you know, is the norm and people don't have access to those basics, those people are being affected. We're seeing increased risk in certain areas, for example, in the production of PPE. So there's been a lot of talk on the news over the last couple of months about, you know, that Australia needs more PPE, we need more gowns, we need more gloves, we need more masks, which is true. And as a nurse, it's something that, you know, I believe in very strongly, that we need to protect ourselves and our workforce. But there was a story of one of the glove manufacturing plants in Malaysia who manufactures 60% of the world's rubber gloves. They'd actually been blacklisted by the United States because of their human rights abuses. They were known to have modern slavery in their factory and refusing to comply, and so they'd been blacklisted. And then all of a sudden, when we needed more rubber gloves, the United States lifted those sanctions, and they were just like, you know, increased production 24/7. We need as many gloves as you produce. We don't care about human rights abuse. And so I think that's an example of how, you know, our supply chains here are affecting people there on the ground. And then just today I was reading about the greater social and economic implications in India. So for example, for people who have lost their jobs, we're seeing an increase in those families in child brides, of increase in debt bondage as well. So where people may have been free workers, albeit being for a small wage, at least they were free. They're now being, you know, forced into borrowing money again because they can't pay their bills, and going back into debt bondage and having to send their children out to work to pay off those debts. And, you know, we know that that when crises happen, that the traffickers are often the first people on the ground. The traffickers are resourceful, agile, fast moving, and so we know where people become vulnerable, they're also more vulnerable to human trafficking as well. So, I mean, I could go on. The impact of COVID on supply chains and on the people at the end of those supply chains is catastrophic. And I think looking at this end from Australia, I think it also gives us an opportunity of where those supply chains have been interrupted to actually reevaluate. It's an opportunity to have conversations with large corporate entities to say, look, your supply chain has been interrupted. You need to find new suppliers. So how about you start including the SDGs in your supply chains? Start now to be more transparent, to be more agile, to be more accountable in your supply chains. And so for companies where, you know, their complete resources were cut off, you know, looking at, well, if you can't source from those factories anymore, how about you look at more sustainable options, more where the workers are actually getting paid a fairer wage. So while the impact of COVID is catastrophic, it's also an opportunity here for us to reevaluate what we're doing in terms of our supply chains and how we can actually build towards a more sustainable future.
Well, the government also has to have it more sort of transparent in a way. They have a big share of responsibility in the supply chain, if you know what I mean. And they really should open it up and give more opportunities for fair trade people to market their products without limitations. At the moment, the government is on a blame game situation where they're blaming each other for failure or whatever. I think we really need to get together to sort of encourage everybody to grow and make opportunities and to open up rather than restrict people, to make sure that everybody gets open to for success.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is correct. There has to be some sort of leverage that the government provides to ethically practicing organizations and cleaner supply chains. And that brings me to Nicole. I just wanted to extend that question to you and also just touch on one more thing, where what is the legislation or policy that supports you as a business or as someone who wants to practice with purpose, and what can change?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the bugbears we have in business is that we're actually penalised for being an ethical company. As penalised as far as paying fair trade fees, and there's a lot more friction involved in sourcing through fair trade than just going to any old supplier. So everything takes, a bit longer, everything costs a bit more, which means we have to work doubly hard to get a parity product on the shelf at a price that's competitive. I mean, I'm a big advocate for legislation and working through the tax system. I mean, the biggest driver for business and the things that drive business decision making are tax and legislation. And to me, I think that's the answer, really. Consumers can do so much, but really the onus isn't on consumers to know the ins and outs of supply chains. It should be put onto business, and it should be through legislation, because so much resources actually goes into trying to get business to do the right thing, whereas they should just be forced to do the right thing, really. So, I don't know how hard political campaigning is compared to, say, Sarah's approach of work, trying to get business to do the right thing. But that, business decisions are predominantly driven, as I said, by, profit legislation and tax. So I would like to see those levers changed to help drive the change that we all want, so that producers get a better deal and that supply chains are clean and fair. So yeah, I mean, that's basically our take, but we're working with what we've got at the moment, which is fair trade, which is a great, a great alternative at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really challenging that classic Milton Friedman's definition of the purpose of business again. But I think in terms of policy, we haven't moved very far from that. And really getting back and rethinking that notion, trying to figure out how to incentivize that the uptake of fair processes and ethical supply chains. And so that's an interesting point, actually. Give me 1 second. Yeah, so I just wanted to ask of the speakers just a couple of the social and economic implications of the pandemic. So I know Sarah already touched on quite extensively on how it's manifesting in different countries. Nicole, do you have anything to share about how, in your personal experience, there have been changes and disruptions?
Yeah, there's definitely been a lot of disruption being a product-based business. So, I mean, our priority during COVID was obviously to make sure staff are safe and to keep our product moving through the supply chain. And hopefully getting it to the right place at the right time has been definitely really challenging through COVID. Things such as ports being closed, factories operating at half capacity, that's really affected us. One of the great things about being Fairtrade is that we have really close relationships with all our supply partners and our manufacturing partners. So, you know, we've managed as best we can, and that's been sort of really good. We've been able to get through for that. And we have had stories come through from farmers as far as our smallholder farmers, as well as plantations. For example, one of the plantations in Darjeeling lost their first flush because they couldn't get the workers they needed to do that. So they've lost a lot of income there. On a positive note, the smallholder farmers that are mainly family-based farms, they've been fine because they're not reliant on outside labour, so they've been able to continue on okay and harvest and get their crops to the manufacturers okay. So yes, stories like that. Business is just a series of problems to solve from our perspective, and we just try and get on and solve them all as best we can and keep everything flowing, to be honest.
Absolutely. Molly or Zeny, do you want to talk a little more about how the pandemic is affecting different parts of the world? Or perhaps, actually, just to draw that back a little bit, how about just understanding how we can move past that problem? So say going forward, you know, being able to channel the billions of dollars in stimulus that we're seeing from the government in support of businesses, and just trying to challenge those voices that are saying, hey, sustainability is not important right now, or, you know, ethical supply chains are not important right now because we need to figure out how we can pay rent. And I wanted to just challenge that notion that's floating around and see where your thoughts are on that. So Molly first. Mute.
Thank you. Look, this is a huge issue. I mean, you know, we're going to see millions of people die, and already in the U.S. there's nearly 200,000 that have died. That's particular malfeasance. But I think, you know, we have a global health crisis, and of course, as is always the case, the most vulnerable are going to be the most impacted. So we really do have to take the health crisis very, very seriously, and those of us who can wear PPE and do all the things that we can do and try to get it shut down as soon as possible really need to feel that deeply, because it's not just us. Someone's going to get on a plane and go to, you know, somewhere, and, you know, in all those countries where there is no social net and safety net, you know, it is going to just be absolutely ghastly. So we have to take the health crisis and the recovery of that very, very, very seriously. And we already know, as Sarah really beautifully explained to us, there is a humanitarian crisis that is, you know, already there. So, you know, in Fairtrade, we saw massive drops in the beginning. All of our licensees that are doing sales in retail or have good e-commerce and online programs are doing great. Cafes are diabolical all over the world. And we have, you know, some that are, you know, really hitting the wall because if they only have cafe, they're, you know, super duper elite cafe drinks and things, you know, it's very hard. So we're seeing the full spectrum in terms of the general impacts. But in terms of the opportunity, I mean, there's a couple of things to point out. One is that there's more than $9 trillion that are already mobilized to have stimulus spending in governments in the G20 almost exclusively. And if we use that money well to build things back better and to design a new normal with using the Sustainable Development Goals as our framework of what we're trying to achieve, then actually, you know, we could come out of this much, much stronger. You know, we could have simultaneous investments in you know, poverty alleviation and real investment in the kinds of things to support companies, not just to build another gas coal-fired station, but actually to invest in supply chains where they're bringing in, you know, products from vulnerable countries where their business. And I have to share that the team during Fairtrade Fortnight just had the most beautiful approach to this, supporting local businesses in Fairtrade who are helping the world. It is making the world better because you are supporting your local business. You are helping, you know, Australian, New Zealand businesses, Pacific Islanders, and you're actually making the world better. So we can invest that well, or we can invest it badly. At the moment, they're investing it quite badly. I think they've got a panel for their energy program, which is all made of gas executives. And, you know, there's lots of bad ways to spend this money, but we have examples and we know it's possible. So in the global financial crisis, South Korea stood out in the world as having most effectively aligned their global financial crisis stimulus packages with their sustainability, climate change, and digital transformation goals. And we know that digital transformation is going to be important for everybody. We need to make sure one of the great poverty problems is lack of digital availability. And if you're a kid right now and you don't have access to digital, you don't have an education wherever you are in the world. And you can guess that most kids in the developed world have access to the internet, and most kids, most places in the rest of the world don't. So, or a very narrow margin do. So we have an opportunity to do it well. We have to be putting enormous pressure on our governments to influence that and to say, we're watching. We want you to spend this on things that are going to actually address these issues with the Sustainable Development Goals, because they are a great guidepost to help us invest better in future. And our great hope, of course, is that we can build a new normal. You know, it's very hard. I mean, we're going to be in a, we heard this morning from a wonderful leader of sustainability, Jeffrey Sachs, who basically said, we are in a global recession, depression. We are going to stay in that global depression for a long time. It's going to be at least, he thinks, 2 years before we get a vaccine that works. So we're going to have to support, you know, we can't rush to the cheapest, lowest common denominator. We've got to actually support those companies that have multiple benefits to society and are looking at this from a modern slavery point of view, from a business development point of view, but with the recognition that a small investment is a huge impact. There was actually a program my son was showing me yesterday. It was Joe Stiglitz, who's the Nobel Prize winner for economics. And he was basically saying what the COVID thing is doing right now in the US is making the rich way richer, because the stock market is kind of going wham, wham, wham. So the top 1% is actually, you know, going that way. And even in the US, as we heard this morning, you know, there are a lot of people who can't put food on the table and who have lost their jobs as cleaners and as shop assistants and as all kinds of things, that cafe workers, and they're not getting the kind of support that they need. And there's really poor healthcare in the US. So the world has become this kind of, you know, giant divide. And this process and this whole COVID thing is accentuating that very badly. But what I think is that, you know, when you think about it, right now in the US, they're putting less than 1/6 of 1% into development aid. And that's shocking for a country that rich. I mean, this is part of, you know, the problems that we've got with the US right now. But actually, if we just started to think about what would it look like if the top 1% put 1% of their wealth into these things. What if all of us in the developed world just put 1% of our GDP into supporting these kinds of things? 1% of those two numbers would get us way, way, way past anywhere where we would have ever been before. And I guess the other thing is that, you know, these structural issues include bigger issues than we can talk about here. But one of the big ones, because of this 1% problem and with this huge diversity, is actually tax structures around the world and the tax havens, and the way that, just like trafficking, human trafficking and modern slavery, you know, the way money runs in the world enables, you know, criminal activity, and that is denying the world the reasonable resources to be able to address many of these problems. So I hate to throw that one in the ring because it is a big one. But Kim, you know, Kim organized the whole G20 and the C20 when it came to Australia, and a big part of that agenda was actually tax reform, and that was back in, oh God, I don't know when. Kim, you might have to tell me, 98 maybe. So, you know, these issues are on the agenda, but we can do it, but it's not going to be easy to do it. And it's going to require very, very significant pressure on governments, even here in Australia, to actually take seriously these stimulus investments. And it's going to take a watch group, probably like ACFID or one of those fabulous organizations that can help us track what's going on to actually see what sort of success we're having with that. It's a big job.
Great. Yeah, Kim just responded for 2014.
Oh, thank you, Kim. Where are you? Thank you, Kim. Oh, 2014. Oh, yeah. My God.
It does feel like a lifetime in your defense. This year has taken so long to get to, what are we in, August? Right.
Right, I know.
I've forgotten the fine line that existed between weekdays and weekends. They all tend to be the same sometimes.
And working hours and a life.
Right. But yeah, it is very interesting how I think today it was announced that Jeff Bezos became the first person to cross $200 billion in net worth. Whereas there are people who literally lost everything on the other side of the city, perhaps.
What do you do with that kind of money? I mean, honestly, what is 1% of that? The mind boggles. You can't fathom. I mean, it does make you really respect the work that Bill and Melinda Gates have done all these years, because it is, you know, such an obvious thing to give back when you've taken that much from the world. Absolutely.
And just also to share something with everybody, there is an initiative called 1% for the Planet, which does ask everybody to pledge 1%, and they partner up with organizations and businesses around the world just to ensure that it's a sort of new emerging framework. I'll just share the link so that everyone can go check it out when they
That would be great, because I remember when they were getting going quite a few years ago, actually, they really, you know, have had a couple of efforts at this. I actually think now that we're starting to talk about the other end of the 1%, that it will get much more traction, and should really get traction, because it is insane.
Absolutely. Zeny, I have a question for you now. I mean, and it really revolves around how we further progress out of this situation, or as we move forward, as we revive and eventually, hopefully, thrive. SDG 17, I feel, is so important, which is collaborative partnerships and working together. And really, especially with what Molly said about how we can channel the stimulus, how we can rethink how we invest all our efforts back into society. What are your thoughts, or where do your thoughts lie on what we can do?
Thanks, Pavid. Unfortunately, the COVID has restricted travel. Yeah. So the experts and those who are working for the United Nations and the World Bank and all that are restricted. They can't travel to these countries because of the limitations to travel, either from the other countries. And so travel is severely limited. I know my son works for the World Bank. Oh, wow. And he's in charge of the Pacific countries, and he can't travel. So he goes through Zoom, but there's a limit as to how much Zoom interaction you can do. You really need to be on the ground. And I think the solution there is to reallocate your resources to sort of enhance your in-ground services and your in-house training programs, and just delegate it to people who that's one of the sort of the processes that might be implemented now that while the COVID pandemic is going on. It's going to go on for another year or so, and I think the training of people who are already in the area by these experts, although it's long distance training. I think that's where it will go. Also, there is the UN COVID-19 Response and Recovery Fund, which has been established, and it aims to specifically support low and middle income countries as well as vulnerable groups who are disproportionately bearing the socioeconomic impacts of the pandemic. So this is being led by the UN Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed, and she's working with other women leaders to sort of implement this and activate this program. So it's worthwhile having a look at that. I also need to stress the importance of looking after the mental health of the because they are impacted, and this gives rise to domestic violence and all sorts of, you know, you become so inward looking that there's crime and there's abuse, and it's just going to be the next problem here. You can see it. I mean, the news today while I was waiting for this Zoom is people are shooting everybody. I mean, people are sort of getting into accidents and drugs and all. So that is a problem because of the stress and the health impacts will have a great sort of effect on everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. It is extremely horrifying to see the news, and sometimes it's even important to take a step back because every day is almost worse than the previous sometimes. And there's so much happening in the world that looking at each individual issue is almost a whole initiative by itself, which is required to be addressed. And so that sort of notion, I wonder if it is going to help us look at issues collaboratively. And I wanted to think of, or ask rather, what are ways that we can influence businesses and governments today? Because one of the things, again, like I mentioned, is that nobody wants to allocate funds towards sustainability at the moment. There aren't, I mean, when I say nobody, I mean the majority goes back to the classical approach saying, we invest in the free markets, they'll do that job, and then, you know, something's going to work out, and eventually we'll come out of this successful. So time will help us, and time's on our side. But what sort of support do you think will be most beneficial for organizations today and ethical businesses, purpose-driven organizations, to address these key challenges of the pandemic, and to, while doing so, work towards achieving the sustainability goals, combating climate change, combating modern slavery, and all these pressing issues that we have aside from the pandemic? And I'd like to start with Nicole.
Yeah, look, I think the Modern Slavery Act is a really good entree for businesses to start that journey of thinking about slavery in their supply chain. And I think it would be really beneficial if there was, I think there's some resources available, but if businesses were made aware of the legislation and then also how to change, how to adapt to it, and how to make sure they're compliant. I'm not sure if the government is providing assistance with that, but that would be a really good entree because it's a bit of stick and carrot. There's, you know, it's legislation, so immediately it'll get pushed up the to-do list because, you know, they're wanting to be compliant. It's a risk for them if they're not compliant. So that needs to be spelt out to businesses that, hey, there's this legislation. It's a risk to your company if you're not compliant with this. And, you know, it's something that people probably would like to be compliant with, just from a philosophical perspective. Most people want to do the right thing. It's just that it never makes it to the top of the to-do list because there's so many other pressing things you know, as you mentioned, like, you know, problems to solve, and they've got to get product here and do this and do that or whatever, manage staff, etc. But if it is legislation, then it gets pushed up the list. So I think that's a really good entree to get businesses to notice, at least. The COVID, I'm not so sure about really, because it's probably different for every kind of business on how they manage the fallout from COVID. But yeah, definitely the Modern Slavery Act, I see that as the entree for businesses.
Lovely. Does anybody else want to add to that?
Just in regards to the Modern Slavery Act, for residents of New South Wales, there is an urgent need at the moment for the New South Wales Modern Slavery Act to come into play. So as you know, we have the Commonwealth Act, which was passed in 2018. The New South Wales Act was actually passed earlier than that and was ratified and was then put on hold for review in relation to the Commonwealth Act. But it's due to be announced in September whether or not the New South Wales Act will actually come into play. So there's a petition, there's a link on our website if you want to go there, for New South Wales residents to sign a petition for that to be reignited again in New South Wales Parliament. So it shouldn't have to be rediscussed because it's already been passed. It's the recommendations of the review committee have already been considered, but it's an urgent necessity to actually get as many New South Wales people to respond to that as possible. So that's some proactive measures that we can take today in order to actually see that the New South Wales Modern Slavery Act come into play, because it's much stronger than the Commonwealth Act. There's penalties for non-compliance. It relates to companies who earn over 50 million instead of over 100 million. It includes the Modern Slavery Commissioner, a hotline. There's all sorts of resources available in the New South Wales Act. So we want to see that passed. So if you can just go, if Susanna's saying, can we share the link? But if you just go onto our website, unshamed.net.au, there's a link on there, which people can follow to sign that petition. But you have to be a resident of New South Wales to sign it. But if you're not, you could at least forward that on to your networks and people that you know.
Perfect. Thank you for sharing that. We'll definitely try to pull up the link and share it in the post-event group that we'll create. And I'll touch on that once we reach. We're coming close to finish, and I did ask a bunch of questions from the audience, but we have Dan who's put their hand up. So I'm just going to ask you to unmute, Dan, if you want to ask the question, or if you could just send me the question on chat.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Absolutely.
Okay. I thought I've sent a little post out to say we have a surprising good news story in relation to COVID in the Solomon Islands, an unexpected one. We've got I'm the founder of the social enterprise Coconut Pacific, which won the 2018 award from of the Ethical Enterprise Award. And we have a major project in the Solomon Islands, and the Solomon Islands has been hit by a invasion of a strange rhinoceros beetle, which has killed something like 75% of the palms around the capital. We have been converting those into charcoal. Now, and we ended up with an enormous pile of 600 bags of charcoal and saying, how on earth are we going to sell these? And then COVID struck. All the non-essential workers from the capital were sent back to their villages, and the people in Honiara suddenly realized that gas was imported, kerosene was imported, and then we had a social media campaign that said, well, try our smokeless charcoal. In the 3 months, we sold all 600 bags of charcoal to the people in Honiara, and they're now demanding more and more. So there's been a complete change. And the interesting thing is that indoor air pollution of cooking on wood has been a fundamental health problem for the Solomon Islands. And now our extension staff going out to the villages and so on are teaching people how to make charcoal and cook on it. And this is a good story that comes out of COVID. So I thought I'd like to at least share one good story.
Thank you so much, Dan. It is so bleak when we talk about all these pressing problems, although these are extremely confronting conversations, they must be had. But your story that you just shared is something that is so refreshing to know that amidst all the chaos and amidst all the stress, there is the silver lining. And I think that is a great thing to think about moving forward, taking on from what we learned from Molly, Sarah, Zeny, and Nicole about how we can potentially focus our efforts moving forward from this pandemic, looking out, handling the funds and the energy that we should in the right directions. We can actually see a much more sustainable future for ourselves, irrespective of what crisis we hold on to at the moment. And I think the last thing is, I believe resilience is something that is often overlooked. And one of the key elements of the Sustainable Development Goals is building resilient communities. And effectively, if we marry all these ideas together and put it all together on paper and actually see it in effect, I think we will build more resilient communities that are stronger when such uncertainties strike. So yeah, that's a very crucial point as well that I wanted to share. But yes, we're just about at 7 p.m. So does anybody have any final comments before we come towards close? Anything they'd like to share? Any of our speakers?
Just on a good news story as well. I think, you know, often we can sort of look at large corporates in Australia and think, oh, you bad corporates, you've got slaves in your supply chain. And our approach is very much a positive engagement with the issue. And so one of the things that we do is to talk to corporates about the urgent need, which is why we give our profits to, you know, sustainable businesses and things. And so we had one company that we ran a workshop in and looking at their supply chains, and they, you know, were horrified to learn about how many gaps they actually had in their processes and systems. And so they went ahead and ran a fundraiser for a sustainable business in India that we highlighted. You know, everybody made cakes and they sold cakes online and had a really innovative fundraiser and sent the funds directly. So while they're still looking at their supply chains and, you know, working out how they can make a bigger systemic difference, they, you know, recognize the urgent need to send funds into a sustainable context. And so I think, you know, as we continue to move forward, we need to keep that in mind to inspire people to take immediate action as well. And I'm encouraged, to be honest, by the number of businesses who want to take action, who are voluntarily complying with the Modern Slavery Act. And, you know, I think as we continue to positively engage with those companies, more and more companies will come on board. So I feel like it's not all doom and gloom. There's actually, you know, positive stories in there as well of corporates actually wanting to engage and make a difference where they can.
Absolutely. Positivity actually is quite, I'm forgetting, oh gosh, it's my word of the day that I'm not getting in my mouth. Positivity is contagious. It really is contagious. And
it beats fear.
Absolutely. And to end this conversation, does anybody have, or I would throw this question to the open table for speakers. What would be the final comments you'd like to share with the world, with businesses of tomorrow and today, and with people, just to inspire them from your experience and your great rivers of knowledge, if I could say the least. How can they, moving forward, contribute towards a fair trade, ethical, sustainable process and contribute to the goals of tomorrow?
Certainly very rewarding being part of the solution. And yeah, I just encourage businesses to take a step and then take another step, because every little thing counts and every little thing matters, from choosing, you know, carbon neutral paper to buying fair trade tea and coffee for your tea rooms. So yeah, just everything helps, that's for sure. And can I also add that we've recently launched our bourbon vanilla tea in Woolworths. So head along to Woolworths if you want to try Element's organic vitamin tea. And also we have free samples available on our website. So you're welcome to go to elementswithano.com, and you can pick up a sample, and feel free to share the link throughout your networks. That would be much appreciated.
It is such good tea.
Thank you.
Take Molly's word, and I'll take yours too, Nicole. Great. Going to my shopping cart right away. Yeah. Oh, but we're past curfew hours for the pickup, so probably tomorrow. And
look, I'm happy to just share a final thought, and that is that I do think it's fascinating how this has changed our everyday. And one of the things people aren't doing is shopping for things that are not essential. And that's transformative. I mean, my hope is that the fashion industry, which is really one of the most destructive and scary industries, will actually have to completely rethink what it does, because it is really in a terrible state. But we really are going back to realizing what actually matters, and that time with our kids actually matters, and that wardrobe full of stuff actually doesn't really matter. And you know, it's amazing how you can get away with, you know, a very, very modest wardrobe when you only have to wear, you know, most people are in their dacky dacks and their jammies. So it is a really great opportunity. It's a golden opportunity, I think, for us to really think about what matters, both as individuals, as companies, as participants in the world. And there's also great evidence from a lot of good analysis out there that this isn't just my imagination. You know, EY, Deloitte's, they've all done studies looking at consumer trends, and people are starting to think differently and realize what they actually need, and the difference between that need and want, which has been blurred so beautifully by capitalism over so many years. So I would just say it is a moment when inflection and change is really possible. It's forced on us right now, but actually it's possible to take the positive out of it and figure out, what do we want to change? What do we want to do differently? And I think that is you know, is really being looked at by many, many people on many levels in personal lives and in businesses in different countries. So I'm hopeful that really will enable us to come up with not ever getting back to the old normal, but actually redefining the new normal and then creating the new normal, because we do know how.
Absolutely. Redefining the new normal is where we should be and where we should be looking. And Zeny, do you have anything to share as a close?
Yes, and I think we need to enhance the mindset. We're not just buying a quality fair trade product, we are providing a service to humanity. So that is the motivation. That is what I buy. I mean, I could buy the best coffee or whatever product there is that's being advertised. I buy the fair trade because I know that somewhere out there I'm helping a farmer. And to me, that becomes more important than just buying. It's helping, providing a service to humanity. To me, I think that needs to be promoted.
Making the world a better place.
Yes.
That's a way to finish. And yeah, on that note, I'd like to just end on this statement that I just thought of when we would just to draw on all of these conversations, if we're paying a premium, we might as well pay that premium to make the world a better place, and might as well pay that premium not for a brand, a novelty or vanity, but to ensure that somebody's kid goes to school, or someone gets to eat their meals 3 times a day, and people get to live under a roof. And it's not just the 10% of the world's population that has those 3 things. So on that note, thank you so much, speakers. Thank you, everybody who attended. And we look forward to being able to share this with our networks. And we will be creating a Slack group and sending an invite to everybody. So we encourage the discussion to carry on further. For those who weren't able to make it to the event, we'll be sharing this conversation with them and adding them to the Slack group. So as soon as they get there, I'm sure there's going to be questions storming right through the door. So up until then, thank you so much and have a great evening.